Good afternoon and welcome to the Caregiver Teleconnection. My name is Glenda Rogers and I'm going to be your facilitator for today's session. Today we have with us Dr. Natalee Oliver, and we're always glad to have her with us. She's going to be talking about a really interesting topic today, dementia and ambiguous loss. And she told me before the session started that she's been wanting to do this session for a long time. So I'm so glad that she found the time to put this together. So Natalee, before you get started with your presentation, would you tell people just a little bit about yourself and how you got into this area of work?
Sure. Thanks for having me. I was in school and I was getting my master's in gerontology. That's the MSG. And one of the assignments was to spend the night in the nursing home and take on the role of someone with Alzheimer's. And that's the first time that I had knowingly been around people with Alzheimer's, and it impacted me. And I knew that I was going to serve those living with a form of dementia or family members or educate students about it. I just knew I was going to be involved in some way.
Well, thank you for sharing that.
Sure. Okay, you ready for me?
We're ready to go.
All right, here we go. And I just wanted to let everyone know that what I'll do is I will send this PowerPoint in PDF form to Glenda. You'll still be able to get all the links of everything, so you don't have to worry about taking notes. I know that can be stressful. So here we go. This is just a quick summary of what we're talking about today. I always like to give a clinical background so you know who you're listening to today. And so just gives you a visual, but basically I'm a clinical social worker, and I have provided therapy to older adults and their adult children. And I've just worked in many different capacities, but my heart is always serving caregivers and those living with Alzheimer's disease. And then just a little bit of personal history is my father and mother moved in with my husband and I about a year and a half ago now. And my dad is about in the middle stages of dementia. And so, as I say, all this book knowledge, which is great to have, we need to understand the disease process, but I've seen it in a whole new light now that they're living with us as well. I always like to include some numbers just because I like us to understand the impact of Alzheimer's disease. And so currently there are 6.7 million Americans age 65 and over that are living with Alzheimer's disease in the US. And generally we know once people get diagnosed at age 65 or later, they generally live 4 to 8 years after diagnosis. But that also depends on what other medical conditions are and when did they actually get diagnosed. But I'm sure many of you already know people that have lived past that 8 years, maybe even up to the 20 years. And then many of you are caregivers that are on here today. And currently we have more than 11 million Americans that are providing unpaid care. So it just goes to show you the relevance of what we're talking about today. And I'm really glad that you're here. Dementia is this relational condition. It doesn't just impact one person. It impacts the whole family, the neighborhood, everyone that's involved in their care. And the reason I wanted to talk about ambiguous loss is because the absence of a cure or the finality of death, dementia is kind of people that are living in this shadow land. So we're going to kind of break that down and talk more about that. And we're primarily focusing on caregiving today, but I did want to touch on this. Obviously, the person with dementia is experiencing grief and loss. And we know that in the early and middle stages of dementia, many experience depression and anxiety, which is understandable. But as far as today's topic, we also want to help the person with dementia that's working through losses and grief. And so just to remember that they may not be able to verbalize or express what's going on, but they still may have this general feeling something's wrong, something's changing. And of course, we want to be supportive to them. And we want to have more of a positive focus and focus on what they still can do versus what all they can't. And so that means we need to acknowledge their grief and their loss and listen to them and listen with empathy. And we know empathy is not sympathy. It's not, oh, I feel sorry for you. Empathy is, I'm going to get down in those trenches and I'm going to walk alongside you. And that's what we want to do. And as they're experiencing this grief and loss, we want to offer comfort, reassurance. And the main thing is we're wanting to have these meaningful connections and keep those going. And so I just wanted to touch on that as we talk today. But I love this picture. It really shows just the maze that we have in life, but especially as caregivers for someone with dementia. And if you are a caregiver, you've probably gone through many of these feelings that you see listed, which can be denial. There's times when you probably get angry and frustrated, maybe sadness or even clinical depression. There are times you might feel embarrassed, lonely. You may feel like even as the caregiver that you're a burden to other family members because you're needing help. But there's also times you feel contentment, and you also hopefully are still finding moments of joy. But the one I didn't list on that page was talking about grief and loss. And so when we're talking about grieving the losses along with the journey, we're saying that going through these losses and grief, it is normal. And grief is a healing response to loss. But the thing with dementia is that it's ongoing. It's not just a one-time thing. And so as these changes occur, it can be helpful to identify and acknowledge those losses on the way. And it's so important that we have support during this time. And we know some of the common changes that can lead to these feelings of grief might be that your loved one has losses in memory, their cognitive function, even their independence, losses of ability to drive and do things. And you may be mourning the loss of, well, I had plans that we were going to travel together. If it's your spouse, I had a certain idea of how it was going to be at this certain stage of life. And you also may be feeling grief and loss because you're having to adjust to be the primary caregiver. And so the thing that I hope you hear today is that healing can happen, but we have to walk through that pain and we have to walk through the grief and the loss. And as we experience this loss of loving someone and caring for someone with a form of dementia, it's not usually recognized by professionals and a lot of times by others that don't understand dementia. And so because it's not this finality, someone's been diagnosed with dementia and we're losing who they are and parts of them, but they're still physically here. And so a lot of times society just doesn't talk about it. And so it can leave us feeling so much alone. And even though we have over 11 million caregivers, many of them feel alone and that no one understands how they feel. And so as a counselor, as someone who loves someone with dementia, I'm just here to tell you that we need to name these feelings, we need to talk about them, and we need to walk through this process. And so a lot of us are grieving the relationship that's changing. And a lot of times we have this confusion in our roles with the one we love, whether it's our parent, our romantic partner, our neighborhood person. No matter what it is, roles are changing. And those thoughts come in, do they even know who I am? And this can cause this grief to be excruciating and complicated. And the thing that we're doing is we're going through this continual loss through the disease process. And so it doesn't just stop. And there are times when we even may reflect and go, am I still their spouse? Am I really still their child? Who really are they? And those are common, and it's okay to feel those things. And so as we're loving someone with dementia and we're going through the losses and the changes, we're on this emotional roller coaster. And like I alluded to a while ago, many times we're just the caregiver. And so people aren't really considering what we're feeling and what we're going through. And we don't have certain rituals and certain customs that go to being a caregiver of someone with dementia. And the creator of Ambiguous Loss, I have a lot of great quotes of what she says in her literature. And she says, it takes extraordinary strength to be a caregiver. But at the same time, when we're loving someone with dementia, we may feel betrayed and abandoned by this disease. And sometimes we're looking to see that I'm only seeing half the person that I know and love. So I do want to briefly talk to you about the history of what we term ambiguous loss. And ambiguous is ever changing, it's unclear, and it was created in the 70s by Dr. Pauline Boss. She was a psychologist and she was a professor. And she used this term ambiguous loss because she felt like grief was frozen and that the grief of loving someone with dementia goes without resolution while they're still physically alive. And she said, we really have to recognize what's going on with this before we can get help and help others. And so she said, what we learned from research and clinical work is that ambiguous loss is a relational disorder. Like we mentioned earlier, it's not just the person going through it alone. We need to still find that connection with them. Some people just cannot cope with ambiguous loss. So some people, when they know their loved one is diagnosed with dementia, they may do premature closure. They may shut down and stop visiting them and not want to deal with it. It's just too much because they're like, oh, they're already gone, so why continue? Then we have some on the whole other end of the spectrum that may say, it's not really happening. They've always been forgetful. So they're in that denial phase. And so, but as we accept ambiguous loss, we know we have to walk through this heartbreak of dementia. And it's a heartbreak. Now, to be fully transparent, there are two types of ambiguous loss, but what we're focusing on today is when they're physically there, but psychologically absent or changing. And this is the one where we're saying their emotions are changing or missing, they're cognitively changing. And this is what she was talking about with those living with Alzheimer's or a form of dementia. And so they're still physically there, but their mind, their memory is changing. And I know from literature, from personal experience, that can be so hard because they physically are looking the same. And we have to remind ourselves things are changing in their brain. So what exactly is ambiguous loss? Why is it important? And it's basically this type of loss of someone with dementia who is physically here, but they may not mentally or emotionally present in the same way as before. So the way you knew someone before is not the same. It's changing. And so, like I mentioned earlier, they're still living. So a lot of times we don't get the support and the understanding from others. And so a lot of times we can't find closure in the traditional way that we would mourn the loss of someone. And you might have heard this term complicated grief or continued grief. And so, again, it's hard for us to recognize how to grieve. And a lot of times we're having to put our life on hold. And this can be really hard. And we have to continue to cope with this loss as the disease progresses. And for some people, it prevents them from moving on. Like I said earlier, they may get frozen with what's going on. But we, as caregivers of someone with dementia, we have to be present. We have to meet them where they're at. And that can be really, really hard. So we have to learn to work through these feelings. We need to begin that grieving process while they're still alive because we are losing part of them while all the while staying connected to them. And what you'll find, and what you probably are finding as you're walking alongside your loved one, is that you're finding your own strengths as you go through this, and you're finding that you are more resilient than you probably give yourself credit or maybe even recognized. And so how does ambiguous loss differ from ordinary loss? Well, In traditional grieving, a lot of times, and I'm going to say generally, women, we generally may share feelings, how we want to talk to our friends and talk it through. And a lot of times men will work through grief by doing, they may go start a new project and work through their grief through that way. That's generally, but a lot of times you can have a mix of both. But ambiguous loss is different from the ordinary types of processing grief and loss because there is no verification of death. And so they're still alive, they're still physically here. And again, if we have a physical death, we have rituals, we have a pastor come out, they're pronounced dead, we have a death certificate, we have this whole grieving process. But when someone's dying or diagnosed with dementia, we don't have a standard that we go by. And so you'll see in some of the terms and some of the literature, it's death before death, or they're gone before they're gone. And so it causes this confusion. But what we have to learn is it's called this duality of thinking. And what it means is that people can be absent and they can be present at the same time. So I hope that you can let that sink in, and you may have to think about that for a while. People can be absent. Your loved one with dementia, parts of them can be absent, but they're still present with us at the same time. It does affect us all differently. And some people, like a lot of people that may be perfectionists, a lot of people that think in black and white terms where it's got to be this way or this way, may have a really hard time with not having this preciseness that we have with ambiguous loss, because they are physically there, but they are changing. And so we have to learn to come to terms with living with our loved one and kind of living in limbo. That can be really hard. And so, because again, society says we want things quick, we want things clear cut, we like to find answers. And so sadly, sometimes this living with someone with dementia and where they're there, but they're not really there, it can lead us to feeling helpless, hopeless, and definitely, besides physically, it can lead us to be emotionally exhausted. But I like this quote. It's from F. Scott Fitzgerald. It says, "The test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposed ideas in mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function." So that's what they're talking about, is we're having to deal with someone who is not there, but they're there, and learning how to live in comfort with it being ambiguous, with it being unclear, with it being confusing. When loving someone with dementia, we need to focus on the meaning of our relationship. Again, not just on their losses, not of who they once were, but what's the meaning? What can we get out of this relationship? So what that means is we have to make this psychological shift, and we have to be intentional with it. It's something we have to work with. And so at some point, this time will come when we have to say goodbye to the person that they once were, and we have to say hello to who they are now. We can't keep expecting them to be a certain way when they've changed to someone now. And we have to be the ones that adjust. Some things that we can do to accept this ambiguous loss is that we have to put a name on it. So just even understanding about ambiguous loss can help us process what's going on, that they're here, but they're not here. And so that that can help us process what we're going through. And it can help us from not trying to find and search for that perfect solution. A second thing we need to do is we need to face this problem that can't be changed, and we have to change our way of thinking. Like I said a while ago, we have to change us and not try to change the person living with dementia. And so we have to change how we view it. And so I said it's this duality of thinking. The creator of ambiguous loss, Dr. Boss, calls it paradoxical thinking. So she says it's called this both and language. It can be where, so if it's your spouse that has dementia, She's saying we need to start having this duality of thinking where we say, I am both married and a widow. I'm still married to this person with dementia who is still alive, but I am also a widow and I am also grieving, and I have also lost parts of who they are. And that's okay. And her literature and her studies and her research says by accepting this and by changing our mind and saying it this way and believing it this way, it actually can relieve the stress. And so here you'll see some samples where if we're changing our mind shift, we can say, instead of this either or, that black or white thinking, instead of saying, I can either take care of the person with dementia or myself, I need to use the both and. I can take care of both myself and my loved one with dementia. Instead of saying I am either the person with dementia's daughter or their caregiver, I am both my father's daughter and one of his caregivers. And to live with that duality, that paradoxical thinking. I can either love the person with dementia exactly as they are now, or I can miss how they used to be, versus how Dr. Boss says we should think, I both love the person with dementia exactly as they are now, and I can miss how they used to be. And it's okay to live with both of those feelings. When someone is here and gone, this paradoxical thinking can help us. And this is the reality of dementia. They can be gone and still be here. And a lot, you may feel this, and you may experience this with a lot of caregivers where they feel like, I can't take care of myself, or I'm just a caregiver. Well, I love what Dr. Boss is saying is, no, I'm still me. I still need to take care of me and take care of my loved one. So you are both a caregiver and a person with needs. As we continue to talk about accepting ambiguous loss, we need to know our family and our community. We need to know an information and support system. Because we have this ambiguous loss, this unclear what's going on, that we need some predictability in our lives. And so we need to know, who can I rely on? Sometimes it's family, sometimes it's people we consider like family. Maybe they're not related to us. Sometimes they're more help and more family than some that are blood related. So Dr. Boss calls this psychological family. Who is going to be there for you emotionally, cognitively, relationally? Psychologically, you need to find your psychological family. And she talks about we need to divide up the work, and we need to have this written out plan so that we're not taking on all of the responsibilities as a caregiver. You know how stressful that is. We've done trainings on that, but also having to go through this ambiguous loss and being the primary caregiver. Something else that a lot of people will do when they have a loved one with dementia is maybe they won't celebrate holidays. They just stop doing them. She's saying, Dr. Boss says, no, continue these, but revise them. Maybe we need to simplify the holidays and our traditions, but we've got to keep that human connection, and we've got to help that person with dementia feel the spirit of life all around them. And so having this, continuing those traditions, but kind of editing them or revising them, that's essential to us staying strong. And so how can you simplify your family rituals and celebrations to fit the circumstances now? Something else we need to do as we're accepting ambiguous loss, we need to revise our family roles. We need to make alterations that are needed. We need to make changes. Who in your family can assist you? And something that's real important is we need to match them with their abilities. So some of your loved ones may be able to bring food. Some may be able to sit with your loved one with dementia. Some may be able to take them to the doctor. And so really just what are the different roles in family and matching them with our capabilities. But we have to be able to change. And some people are not good with change. But if we are going to make it through living and loving with in life in general, but especially with someone with dementia, we have to embrace change. and we have to be okay with it. We need to be aware of family rules, and that's a whole nother dynamic. All of the family dynamics that we have in lieu of caregiving. So who's allowed to do what in our family? Do you have a team approach? Or are you expected to do everything? So what are the rules you have in your family? And start to question them. Because again, we've got to embrace this change. Can we talk about that mom has dementia? Are there unspoken rules that only females help with the caregiving, or that males don't, or that someone living close by does this, and because they live far away, they don't have to do certain things? And so really just looking at that family dynamics, what are these unspoken rules that we may have and that we need to be open to change, she says is really important, and so that we can have teamwork. And I love this. Dr. Boss says, include children and teenagers in this circle of information about the illness. And because they can help, they can have great ideas of change that maybe we can't think of. This number 7, accepting ambiguous loss. This next one is tough because it says, understand that anger and guilt are normal. Of course, we don't want to have harmful actions, but there are many caregivers. My mom, we had to work through her guilt of taking care of herself and meeting her other roles in life, because for some reason there is this automatic thing that many caregivers think, because I'm a caregiver, that's the only role I have. And then they can get frustrated and then they feel guilty for feeling frustrated. So what I hope you're hearing today is that it's okay to get angry. It's okay to get frustrated. We need to take care of ourselves. We need to have other supports, which leads to number 8. You have to check on your own health, whether that's getting professional help, whether that's doing the self-care. Dementia's hard. I think it's a lot harder than society says it is, because again, like I talked about earlier, some people just don't want to talk about it or acknowledge it. So if you're feeling depressed, if you're feeling physically sick, sometimes you might feel hopeless, you need to definitely reach out for professional help. Definitely, if you're getting to a point where you're not taking care of yourself and things like that, so reach out to others. And I thought this was interesting. So the creator of Ambiguous Loss, Dr. Pauline Boss, says, for those of us loving someone with dementia, there's really no such thing as closure. She believes that this whole idea of closure is just a myth. And so you've probably heard of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, the stages of grief: denial, acceptance, anger, bargaining, etc. And she's not saying those feelings are invalid. We feel those, but what she's saying is that sometimes we may have days where we accept what's going on with all of this, and some days we may not. And she's saying that's okay. She says eventually, if we learn to accept this duality of feelings, that eventually the good days are going to outnumber the bad. And that it's okay if we have anger days and frustrating days, but that eventually we can work through these because we still find those moments of joy. And so she says that dementia teaches us that grief's door is never completely shut. And you've probably noticed that with grief in life. I mean, I always tell my clients it is like a roller coaster. One minute you may be laughing and finding joy, and the next minute you may be crying, and the next minute you may be, why is this happening? It is a roller coaster. So we should expect that roller coaster and not expect it to be a certain way. And so what she suggests is that we need to embrace this it's a big word, ambiguity. So we need to embrace these shades of gray, that we need to embrace this uncertainty, and that basically we humans are in charge of our perceptions and what they mean. Some other tips for navigating ambiguous loss. Again, just acknowledging how you're feeling. We have to let go of what we cannot control. We might have some control freaks on here, but we have to really say, I'm not in control of this. The dementia's in control. We're not in control. Again, we have to tailor our reactions and what we're going to do around the person with dementia. We definitely need to connect with others. We know depression can be high in caregivers, and we know depression and isolation can go hand in hand. So we definitely need to have our circle of support. And we need to ask for help. Not only ask for it, we also need to be able to accept it. And I know with some of us, it is just innate in us that we're not supposed to ask for help, especially for caregivers, and we're always giving to others. But what she's saying is we need to ask for help and accept it and take care of ourselves. We need to find creative outlets. And so she's talking about express your grief through writing, painting, arts, other things like that. Allow yourself to still have hopes and dreams. You are more than a caregiver. And I hope you hear that as well. It took a lot for, like I said, my parents moved in with us. So I'm seeing this whole other side of my mom being a caregiver. And so we had to really work on her allowing herself to still have hopes, to still have dreams, and to still know that she is more than a caregiver. You need to find a support group. Support groups, we talk about that probably on every session. It's great to have book knowledge. It's great to understand the disease, but there is nothing like having a support group of other people going through what you're going through. Again, you might look for professional help, maybe go to a therapist, maybe go to your clergy. It's so important to be around other families that are experiencing what you're going through, because then hey, they're getting frustrated, they're feeling guilt, they're having the roller coaster feelings just like I am, and it's okay. Sometimes you can only focus on getting through the next minute, the next hour, let alone the entire day, and that is all right. Name your pain. That's one of the suggestions she says. Name what you're experiencing. It is more difficult, most stressful loss there is. But to remember, it's not your fault. And I've noticed that a lot with spouses. A lot of times they'll have this guilt of, I don't have dementia, but they do. So we really need to help them to understand it's not their fault. Continued strategies for living positively with ambiguous loss. Reflect on your losses. Reflect on them. Acknowledge them. Share them with others. Normalize that you're going to have these losses and that it's okay. And again, stay connected with others, looking after your own needs, and let your family and friends know how they can help, rather than assuming people know what you need. Because by now, if you haven't, you probably will. A lot of people don't know what to do when you say my loved one has Alzheimer's or a form of dementia. So what I've learned professionally and personally is I have to kind of explain, here are some changes to expect. Here's what I'm needing from you. Here's what my loved one with dementia, here's some things you could do for them. Share your own experience and recognize and value your growth as a person. As you're walking through this journey of ambiguous loss, you're seeing them physically there, but they're not the same person. You are learning new skills. Your compassion is most likely increasing. You're learning to even be more resilient, and you're gaining this inner strength that you probably didn't realize you had. When we do experience grief, we need to know that grief comes in many forms and that there's different patterns of it. So you may have other friends and family and neighbors that have had a loved one with dementia and thought, well, they went through this. But even though we're all kind of in this group together, we still experience grief and loss differently. And so that's okay. And the thing about accepting this ambiguous loss, it can be hard because we're needing to grieve, but they're still alive. So in our brains, sometimes this defies logic, can be counterintuitive. And so a lot of times people are expecting us to, quote, get over it. But again, like we talked about in the beginning, it's this continued loss. And it's not something that we just can get over. Ways to build your resilience through this process is finding meaning. We know suffering is a part of life. Can we reframe it? Reframing it is where we look at it and say the glass half full versus half empty. And so, again, not blaming yourself for not being able to fix the person with dementia. We have to reconstruct our identity. Who am I now? Who is my family? Where's my psychological support? We need to normalize our negative feelings. It's okay to have these feelings. We just need to process them, admit them. We also need to think of that both and, like I talked about earlier. I am both my father's daughter and his caregiver. And so I can be both. I am both a caregiver and I also have a life, and that is okay. And then we need to discover new hope. As we're working and living with someone with dementia and going through all of these losses and grief, we really are increasing our tolerance. And hopefully we're increasing some humor. Hopefully we are recreating some of our family rituals. And we're not insisting that we must have this closure that society says we're supposed to have. A couple more things I want to throw out there. When we are working through grief and loss and stress of caregiving, tons of literature that talks about writing down your thoughts, journaling them. And I always hear from people, but I don't want someone to find it. It's the process of writing it down. I always say you can tear it up and throw it away. Type it up, then delete it, whatever you need to do. But there is an emotional healing that can start to occur when we put what's going on in our mind and our heart onto paper. And it also can help us have a different perspective on things. We put it on paper, we reread it, and we kind of see it. We can see it differently. Research out there also talks about having a gratitude list. You've probably heard of this if you've attended other trainings. If we wake up each morning or at night and we list a couple of things that we're grateful for, it actually is that reframing, kind of re-looking at things in a different light. Research shows that that helps elevate our mood. So it's important that we still find that silver lining amongst all of this darkness that we can feel at times. Another one as a caregiver that we do so often is we talk so mean to ourselves. I talk to a lot of my clients and I always tell them, treat yourself how you would treat your friends. We have these automatic thoughts that come in and say, you're selfish if you want to do something else besides care for your loved one, or you're not doing enough for them. These thoughts that come in. And if we had a friend sharing that with us, boy, wouldn't we provide support to them. But when we have those ourselves, for some reason we believe them. And so we have this, this distorted thinking. And so really to learn to not accept those automatic thoughts that come into our mind and to change those wordings to be more positive. And I've mentioned this 3 or 4 times, and I hope you hear me, to not go at this alone. You are not the only one going through this. We have 6.7 million Americans age 65 and over with Alzheimer's disease. We have over 11 million caregivers. You are not going through this alone, so please do not go through it alone. This is a poem that was in one of the articles I read, and it was interesting. It was Donna Carnes, and I don't know if anyone's heard of her, but she was a lady that she was out of town somewhere, and her husband said, well, I'm going to go sailing. So he went sailing. He lived in California, and then he was never found. So she had that other type of ambiguous loss. Emotionally, he was still with her, but physically he was gone. So she wrote this poem. You walk on still beside me, my eyes shadowed in dusk. You're the lingering question at each day's end. I have to laugh at how open-ended you remain, still with me after all these years of being lost. I carry you like my own personal time machine, as I put on my lipstick, smile, and head out to the party. And I've read that like 4 times and it gives me chills. But to really just think about that and how we have to still move on. In this, I love how she used, "You're my personal time machine." This, if you decide to get emailed the information, I would print this out. Give it, when people say, "How can I help you?" Here we go. Here's you a list. Be available for me. Be persistent. Don't harass me, but be persistent. Listen without giving advice. Oh, we live in a society where we want to give that quick fix and answer. But when we're grieving and we're processing, sometimes we just want to be heard. When I'm sharing about me, maybe don't always share about you. Because it makes me feel like you're dismissing what I'm sharing. Let me express my anger and my bitterness and don't judge me. Realize that no one can replace or undo the loss. Please be patient and kind and understanding without being patronizing. Don't claim to know what I'm going through. Don't force me to share my feelings if I don't want to. Physical and emotional touch can bring great comfort. We've talked about the importance of touch in other broadcasts. Be there later when friends and family have all gone back to their routines. I've talked about this a lot with my clients too, when they've actually had a physical death. They always say, people are there that first month and then they're gone. So be there continually for me. Don't be afraid of reminding me of the person that lost. Remember me during the holidays. So this is a great list to print out and to give them. This right here, I have not checked any of these apps out that you can put on your phone because I just found this article yesterday, but I wanted to provide it to you. There are these free mobile apps for caregivers, stress and relief. One of them is called Grieve to Relax with the number 2. One's called Happify. One's called SAM, Self-Help for Anxiety Management. One's called Companion. And one's called Depression CBT Self-Help Guide. So you might want to check these out, put them on your phone. They say they're free and they say they help provide with caregiver stress. This is my second to last slide, I believe. And I did want to, because this is tough subject we're talking about, but there is a silver lining of caregiving for someone with dementia. We can still have hope and we can still find moments of joy. As we're providing this caregiving and we're going through this ambiguous loss where they're physically there, but emotionally and cognitively changing, we're having to grow emotionally. Some of us may grow spiritually. We may learn to be more creative, maybe in ways we never imagined on how we handle things. This ambiguous loss, someone living with dementia, gives us time to say goodbye. And if needed, it gives us time to work on any unresolved issues. During this time of caregiving, it allows us to learn more about ourselves and to see how strong we really are. We really are resilient and a lot more than we give ourselves credit for. We can learn that there is comfort in facing our anxieties instead of denying them. And it also teaches us that when we are dealing with grief and loss, not everything's final. Sometimes it's continued. So in summary, because I am a professor and I like to summarize, we talked about how to help the person with dementia live with losses and grief. We talked about common emotions that caregivers feel and experience. We talked about different types of losses and grieving the losses along the way. We talked about the history and the creator of ambiguous loss, which was Dr. Pauline Boss. We talked about types and the definition of ambiguous loss. We talked about how ambiguous loss differs from regular loss and grief, the effects of it. We talked about how we can accept it and different strategies for ambiguous loss. We talked about how we need to build our resilience. And then we have that printout that we can send to others if they say, how can I help you? And this is the last slide I want to leave with you, the parting thoughts. Living with ambiguous loss is a multi-stage process. If there's a silver lining in negotiating this path, it's in the positive personal changes that can occur along the way. Having a loving relationship with someone who can't reciprocate our feelings, it's still worthy, but it is a painful exercise we go through. And in the end, we grow from that suffering we experience when our loved one disappears, but it doesn't have to destroy us. And that's it. Thank you.
Oh, that was jam-packed full of information.
It's heavy. It's a lot to
Whoa.
do in one. It's a lot to do in one, but
It is, but it is just the way you've broken it down, I think makes it more understandable. Because I said to you before we got going, I didn't know what this ambiguous loss was, and now I understand. So that's great. So if you have a question or a comment, the chat box is open. You can unmute your mic. You can raise your hand. Use that little feature if you'd like to. And join Natalie in a discussion of this ambiguous loss. I mean, how did you understand what she was saying? And, you know, have you experienced it as a caregiver, taking care of someone with dementia? Ruth, I see that your mic is unmuted.
Hello, and thank you so much for this presentation. I'm a caregiver support specialist at a local aging and disability resource center. So I actually have a caregiver support group tonight, and I was taking notes. And we talk about ambiguous loss so often, and our caregivers experience it. But I really like the comments you made, like, there is no closure and the door is never completely closed. And I think being able to use those visual comments really gives our caregivers that permission to say, okay, this is normal, what I'm feeling is normal, because they're always thinking that what they're feeling isn't normal and there's something wrong with them. So I really enjoyed this presentation, and when it's recorded, I will certainly encourage our caregivers to check it out. So thank you.
thank you. Thank you for what you do. It's a lot providing a support group. It's a lot. And so thank all of you that provide support groups. That's a lot.
I think the most powerful thing to me was having that both and. I mean, it's so simple. It's so simple, but we just don't recognize it. Yeah, we don't have to just be one thing. Irma says, I've not experienced it. The information was very informative, great information. And Natalie says, I can definitely relate to the roller coaster of feelings. Yes, for sure. When it comes to a mom who has dementia, one day it's happy, the next day I'm crying. Thank you for this helpful information. Yeah. So she can be her daughter and also her caregiver and struggle with both. Absolutely.
And you can still have a life. That seems to be the biggest one, is that you still, and research shows you need to still have a life. You need to take care of yourself, or you're not going to be any good for your loved one with dementia. And we know that intellectually, but we don't put that in our heart. And so we need to understand that.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much for that, Natalie, Irma, everybody, for your comments. Anybody have a question or another comment they'd like to make?
I see Mary Torres just made one.
Okay, Mary, I learned so much. I wish I had these tools when I went through this with my parents who have both passed. I will definitely share this with others. Yeah, I wish I'd had this too when I was caring for my parents. Yeah, and they're both gone too now, Mary. Thank you for that comment.
You know, as I was talking about, I always practice my presentations with my mom to make sure, because she's caregiver, make sure it comes out clear. And she, you know, we were talking about how we've got to get our physicians and our medical personnel talking about this, because they don't, it seems like that a lot of them don't address this ambiguous loss, and we need them to address it.
For sure. Christine said, after 9 years, I'm at a point where it jumped up. I'm at a point where I also mourn the loss of me. Interesting. I'm still here as a body, but that is it. Oh, Christine, yes. That happens so often to caregivers, right, Natalie?
Well, for sure. I mean, over the years, they lose their identity because, you know, I'm a caregiver and that's all. So yes, you've got to, and then you have to find this new normal. what's this new normal of what your life is now as a caregiver? And then once they pass, what is your new normal? And that can be scary and overwhelming, but we've got to plan for that.
Yeah. And the resilience is so important. I mean, 9 years, 9 years.
Yes.
That's,
Yes.
that's a long time. And Natalee asked, and she's talking to you specifically, do you find time to take care of yourself with your parents living with you? And if you don't mind saying, when did you know it was time for your parents to move in with you? Another big dilemma for caregivers.
Oh, for sure. Oh no, my life's an open book, and my family knows we share everything. That's part of being a professor and educator. Well, the first one, how do I take care of myself? Well, I mean, probably more than you want to know. I never wanted children, so we don't have children. We have dogs. So I really do have a lot of time. I work one full-time and a couple of part-time, but I mean, if you have 24 hours in a day, and I don't sleep very well, which I know I want to do a training on good sleep. But so I have time. I don't have children, and I've always been a mama's girl, and I've always been close to my parents. And so, we had talked about it. We've been talking about my parents moving in with us for years before even before my dad had dementia. I knew when they got older, I wanted them to live with me and enjoy some of that stage, because I love people 65 and over. And so, and my husband, we talked about that when we became seriously dating, and he knows that if something should occur with his father, he's welcome into our home as well. That's one of the values that we have. I don't expect everyone to have that. There's reasons we have facilities, but that's something we had talked about. And then when it was time to move in, my mother I don't know if any of y'all have watched that show, Leave It to Beaver. She was like June. I think, yeah, June Cleaver. Her home, she was a homemaker. She used to host everything, all of this. And about, I guess it was, because they've been with us a year and a half. So about 2 years ago, my mom, I mean, she's 79, and she has arthritis. She can't keep the house clean. It's becoming stressful. And she is a very strong woman. So when she came to me and said, I can't do this anymore, because even I wasn't seeing how difficult things for her was, because she's my mom. I don't look at her like I'm Natalee, the professional and should know. And she told me, I can't do this anymore. And I was like, look, it's time. Come on in. And it just all happened really quick. But it took my mom telling me, because people are good at hiding how much they're hurting physically or emotionally. And like I said, I didn't even see how hard things were for her.
And so that
Did I answer?
It sounded good. That gives
Okay.
me the idea too, that you can't just expect, like you were fortunate, your mother told you. We may live in a different town from where our parents are, the person we're, caring for a long distance. So we have to ask and inquire often. Irma said, when you said we got to change the way we look at things, I thought about the serenity prayer, and that is such a wonderful prayer for all of us, especially those of us that are control freaks. Yes.
That's true. But on lines with that, if there is a Bible verse in John, and since we talked about serenity prayer, I'll just mention what's helped me. There's a Bible verse in there that talks about, if we're looking for the world to give us peace, we may not find it. But what has helped me through this process is when I found that verse that said I can look to him for peace. And that's when I finally was able to take a breath and go, I can do this. And so if you can find solace in that, then, plenty of Bible verses out there as well.
Well, that's right. Or whoever your higher power is.
Yeah, whoever your higher power is, correct.
Right. So Natalee said, I love that. Thank you so much for sharing your personal stories.
Sure.
Natalee, shows how important it is, to listen to them. Yeah. Oh, absolutely. You just have to listen to them and understand that you are so right, Natalee. They hide it so well. Hide it so well. It's about independence, don't you think? That fear of giving away your independence.
For sure. And there's this, there's also these roles of, I know my parents, so my mom is thinking, I'm your mom. And I'm 49, but she still thinks she's supposed to take care of me.
Yeah.
And so, and I'm the baby, so I like her too. But, but, so there's this, I think there's part of her that didn't want me to see that. And so, but, we need to turn off all those roles and just go, I love you. So what can I do to help you?
Yeah, for sure. I don't know that I could ever get to that point of saying to my daughter, it's time, because I'm one of those people that says, and I know many of you can relate to this, so don't pretend you can't. You know, they've got such a busy life. She's in a new relationship. You know what I mean? The list goes on and on and on of why we can't, right?
Yeah.
Well, I do want to mention, Natalie said that we'd be sharing her presentation. I'm happy to do that with you. As soon as she gets it to me, I will send it over to our customer service representative. If you did register for the session today, you will automatically get an email that includes that. There was one thing I wanted to look up. Let's see, was the banner Alzheimer's Institute and the Sun Health, and they have a program there that you were talking about. Where they look at ambiguous loss. It was in one of your slides. Anyway, I wrote it down. I'm gonna look it up.
Okay, good. Oh
Yeah.
God, I had so many articles. I can't even remember where.
Yeah. I mean, you know, a class on this, your presentation was fabulous, but to go and have
yes.
the support as you're doing it.
Oh yes, you can get it. You're right. There was, I think it's ambiguousloss.com is where the Dr. Pauline Boss, or if you Google it, I think you can get, I don't know if it's a certification, but you can get a specific training there as well.
Wonderful
So,
to
yes.
know.
Mhm.
I wanted to tell you that, let's see, if you've been tuning in to Dr. Ellett Montgomery-Sklar and Lucy Bearlack's sessions on our Health is Our Wealth, the health promotion series for caregivers, they have one more session coming up on Wednesday, April the 28th at 10 o'clock. Guess what? It's on stress management. We could all use, we could all use that. And I will be back with you on Thursday, the 27th at 1 o'clock Central Time with Dr. Jamie Heisman. He's with us frequently, and I'm so glad about that. And he's going to talk about how to develop a growth mindset as a caregiver. And that kind of goes with what you're saying. You know, we can be both, and you can still have a wonderful life, even if you are a caregiver. So
Yes,
now we
ma'am.
have about 1 minute left. I want to ask, does anybody else have a question or a comment? Well, I don't see anything jumping up here. Natalie, let me personally thank you for this session. I had not heard this topic discussed before, so I always learn a lot from you. And I look
Thank you.
forward to the next time we'll be together.
Yes, ma'am.
And you have something?
Yes, actually, that is incorrect. What Dr. Jamie's going to be talking about, it's going to be the part 2 of the toxic relationship presentations.
Well, that's not what it said on the calendar. So, okay,
I
everybody
know.
make note. Toxic relationship part 2.
See that adapting to change. We have to be able to do that. So
You
there
just
we
go
go.
with the flow, as we say. Thank you, Minerva. I did not
You're
have that
welcome.
information. Thank you, everybody, for taking time out of a busy day to join us. And I hope to see you on future sessions. Natalie, see you in the future also. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye.